I'll do a bit of chatting here for a minute while the ads, since I restarted the stream. I don't even know if it's recording properly. Maybe? Yes, I think so. Perhaps. I don't know. Twitch is weird. Twitch is very weird. Anyway, welcome back, dear viewers, dear listeners, my Librophiles. We are still in ads right now. Discussing a little bit about some of the history of Lucy Maud Montgomery. I think as people kind of filter in and as the ads finish, we'll kind of knock things out. But once again, I am Vexing Cat and might be scuffed from the get-go. I'm not really sure. So we'll see how this goes. I have had both good news and bad news today, and I'm still figuring out what all of it means. But at least we have the book. We have things kind of dialed in. Yeah. Da 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 da. Holy Ezzy. Oh, okay. That must have been a rebranding. Okay. Yep, that was definitely rebranding. They have a whole new aesthetic now. That's wild. Okay, that's pretty cool. Um, so welcome back, dear. Oh, we're almost there. I think the docs are just being weird. Because the ads manager says one thing and then my chat says another. Here we go. Try it again. Hi. I don't know. Dear listeners, I'm not really sure what's going on today. I am trying to get things dialed in, so I appreciate each and every one of you that is sitting here listening to me scuff the heck out of this today. I am trepidatious that I am going to find something in this book that is going to be worrisome. It's just lately, all of the books from this era have had something questionable at some point in the story, and I just, not even questionable, just downright inappropriate. Let me switch over to reading. I'm not sure if, okay, the book is good. Here's a picture of Lucy. So if we're all ready to head in here, let me kind of get things dialed in. I am struggling today. So delete message. Delete. Well, it's good enough. I don't know what I'm doing today. I don't know. I might just scuff the whole stream and all together today. It's been a heck of a day, but I'm getting lots of like at-home stuff done and work-related stuff done, so it's nice knowing that people are kind of checking things out despite me like, spinning all of the plates and dropping half of them. I feel like today was pretty good so far. Good news, my job is currently non-permanent. Is going to be the bad news is my job officially is ending at the end of June. The good news is they're making a permanent position for me, that they have to get, documented and finished up, and then I'll have to apply for it, but I won't have to go through an interview process. I'm rambling. Anyway, hi. Welcome back. It's me, Vexing Cat. Hmm. Okay. I think we're okay now. Everything's sort of lined up. We've got the photo here. So, welcome back, dear listeners. This is Vexing Cat. I am discussing Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is a photo of her. I believe she's pictured here in her 30s. She is an incredible author. I would say she was born here on my end of the neck of the woods in Prince Edward Island. Um, and then she and her parents moved to Western Canada to Saskatchewan. So she's more of a Canadian author, I think, um, realistically. So she moved to Western Canada when she was about just shy of 2 years old. She was an only child between her two parents. Because of being an only child, she had a prolific imagination because she lacked in having any sort of companionship of individuals her own age. So she was really involved with nature, books, writing poetry by the age of 9, keeping a journal when she was little. She spent time with her aunt and uncle and their family in Park Corner. She spent many days playing with her cousins and visiting her grandfather, Senator Donald Montgomery, who lived close to the Campbells. And she loved her Cavendish home and her Silverbush, which was the farm associated with the Campbell family in Park Corner. By age of 6, she began attending one-room school, so like a schoolhouse type education, near her grandparents' home. She completed her earliest education in that one-room school by 1890. Oh, I guess I didn't really talk about when she was born. She was born in November of 1874. So, her first award winning publication was a poem called On Cape Leforce, published at the Prince Edward Island newspaper, The Patriot, in September of 1891. She returned to Cavendish, too late to go to school that year, but she completed grade 10 by 1892. The following year, she studied with her for her teacher's license, which I find interesting. So she completed her grade 10 education and then sought her teacher's license at the Prince of Wales College, completing a 2 year course in 1 year and graduating with honors. So clearly she was highly intelligent, educated, herself, driven. I think her methodology in like that pursuit of higher education probably influenced her interest in writing, especially keeping a journal, writing poetry, would have led to and I guess draw her to written word. Uh, During her brief teaching career, she taught at the Three Island School, Bidford, Belmont, and Lower Bettiskew, respectively. She taught from 1895 to 1896 an English literature course at the University of Halifax in Nova Scotia. She was one of the few women of her time that sought higher education, and she actually did receive money for her writing when she was staying in Dalhousie. Dalhousie? Forgive my pronunciation. In 1898, while Montgomery was teaching in Lower Bettiskew, her grandfather McNeil died suddenly. She returned to Cavendish to take care of her grandmother, who otherwise would have had to leave their family home. She remained with her grandmother for the next 13 years, and so from 1898 to the mid 1900s, or those first 19, I guess it would be 1910. She stayed there, except for one brief period in 1901 for about 9 months when she worked as a proofreader for the Daily Echo in Halifax. During her years in Cavendish, Montgomery continued to write and sent off numerous poems, stories, and serial short stories to the Canadian, British, and American magazines. Despite many rejections, by the bias of her being a woman, she eventually commanded a comfortable income for her writing. By 1899, so while she was living with her grandmother, she earned about $96.88. Not much by today's standards, but it was a nice sum at the turn of the century. Her earnings from her writing increased to $500 by 1903. In 1905, she wrote her first and most famous full-length novel, and that's the one I will be reading, Anne of Green Gables. She sent the manuscript to several publishers. Um, oh, well, take it easy, Flossie. She sent it to multiple publishers and received multiple rejections. So she put the book itself away in a hat box and didn't forget about it, but she set it aside because it wasn't time yet for a larger length novel written by a woman to be published. So by 2 years later, 1907, she found the manuscript again, reread it, decided to try again to have it published, so 2 years after she originally did, and it was accepted finally by the Page Company of Boston, Massachusetts in 1908. So 3 years after she finished writing it, she was finally able to get it published. It was an immediate bestseller. The book was marked as the beginning of her successful career as a novelist. In 1911, her grandmother passed away. She wound up getting married to Reverend Ewan MacDonald, to whom she had been secretly engaged since 1906. So from 1906 to 1911, they were engaged, but secretly. Prior to her engagement, she had two romantic involvements: an unhappy engagement to her third cousin, Edwin Simpson of Belmont, more common practice in that day, and a brief but passionate romantic attachment to Herman Laird of Lower Betticue. After she got married to Montgomery and MacDonald, after their marriage, Montgomery, so Lucy, and her husband Ewan moved to Leaksdale, Ontario, where MacDonald was the minister of a Presbyterian church. She had three sons by Ewan: Chester, Hugh, and Stuart. Hugh passed away as a stillborn in 1914. She assisted her husband with his pastoral duties, and they ran their home and continued to write best-selling novels, as well as short stories and poems. She faithfully recorded entries into her journals and kept up an enormous correspondence with her friends, family, and fans. Lucy Maud Montgomery MacDonald did not live on Prince Edward Island again, returning only for vacations. Thank you so much, Hikara, for the gifted sub. Bountiful Vermin, I hope you enjoy it. Montgomery was a very sensitive and intelligent woman who suffered deeply from the events that affected her personality in the world. In her journals, she expressed her pain at the death of her son Hugh, the horrors of the First World War, the death of her beloved cousin Freed Campbell, and the discovery that her husband suffered from religious melancholia. But despite these and other problems, she continued to write, expressing her love of life, nature, and beauty in fiction, journals, and letters. By 1926, Montgomery MacDonald's moved to Norval, Ontario, where they stayed until MacDonald resigned from being a minister in 1935, so about 9 years after they moved. Then they followed that up with a move to Toronto, where they could be closer to their two surviving sons. Lucy died in Toronto, Ontario in April of 1942, and her husband died about a year later in 1943. Um, in death, Montgomery returned to her beloved Prince Edward Island, where she was buried in the Cavendish Cemetery close to the site of her old home. Montgomery immortalized on this tiny province, the Cavendish province, through her beautiful and wonderful descriptions of life, nature, community, and the people found on Prince Edward Island. All but one of her 20 published novels are set on Prince Edward Island. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people, directly or indirectly influenced by the way of life she depicted, come to Prince Edward Island to see the place she loved so much. I think her work is very descriptive. I think she really put forth this beautiful imagery of Prince Edward Island, which is going to be depicted here in Anne of Green Gables. And I think her work speaks for itself. It's part of the curriculum in Canada. I believe it's part of the curriculum here in America as well. I don't recall it being in junior high or high school here, but I do think it is taught at the collegiate level. Here. This is the cover. This is the cover I found that I thought was the most beautiful depiction of the beauty of the flowers. So in this picture, you see numerous calendula, you've got cow's parsnip, possibly tulips, um, wildflowers of all kinds. And it's just beautifully done in a rose gold on this green background here. Here. So there is this, the version I'm reading, let's see, here's the cover for it, was very dull and kind of simple. It just kind of blue with just the title. It doesn't even have her name on the cover. This edition was produced in, where did I see that? So this is her quite a bit older. So this version is published in, I believe this was published in 1946, and the original story, of course, being from 1908. To the memory of my father and mother, the Montgomerys. So here's a little blurb from Mark Twain, another amazing author, who he wrote this himself. He said, Mark Twain called Anne of Green Gables the sweetest creation of child life yet written. Its immense popularity is proof that many people, like Mark Twain, have fallen under the spell of Anne's charm. Over 760,000 copies of the book have already been sold. Lucy Maud Montgomery, Mrs. Ewan MacDonald, has almost a score of other books to her credit, and these, like Anne of Green Gables, have grown out of her life. She was born in November 20th of 1874 at Clifton, Prince Edward Island, now New London. When she was a year old, her mother died and she was brought up by her grandparents at Cavendish. PEI, she early showed signs of literary ability at 12 years of age, winning a short story contest sponsored by the Montreal Star. In 1890, when she was 16, she spent a year at Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, with her father, who had married again. For one winter, she attended Dalhousie? I don't know how to pronounce that. Dalhousie? It might not have the Dalhousie? Dalhousie. Really? Dalhousie? Dalhousie. Okay. Fair enough. Welcome, Encino. Take a load off. Enjoy yourself. All right. Dalhousie University, where she was a student of Dr. Archibald MacMahon. McMecken, maybe. While still in her teens, she taught school at Biddlesford and Ellerslie in PEI, Prince Edward Island. She returned to Cavendish at 20 years of age to live with her grandmother. This is just kind of a reiteration of what I already spoke of here, it looks like. And Green Gables, together with the farm where Lucy Maud Montgomery grew up, has now been included in the National Park of Prince Edward Island. Many spots in the district, which her writings have made famous, have been preserved as they were described in her books. The the Avonlea of her novels is the town of Cavendish, which she loved especially for the fact that it was close to the sea. She wrote later of her grandparents' farm that it was 12 miles from a railroad station, 24 miles from the nearest town, but only 1/2 mile from the sea. It was here her thoughts turned in later years, when she was living in far distant places, and it is here that she is buried, in the village of Cavendish, where she started her literary career. So, as you can tell, this is kind of a longer novel. I think this is probably going to be 5 or 6 separate sessions to go through this whole book, depending on the writing style and the source material and how verbose she is. Some words, obviously, if they're sesquipedalian and really long, might be a little bit harder. And I'm hoping there's not too many words that I struggle with, but there might be. Um, that I'll have to get definitions for. All right. Hmm. Okay. So today we are beginning Anne of Green Gables. It doesn't. It looks like the chapters do have titles. Um, let's grab that. They did make a movie about Anne of Green Gables. Let me grab that. There was a drama series from Canada. There was a movie. Um, there's been numerous media versions of the story. Let's see, grab, because this is the one I'm the most familiar with. Yeah, I remember this one on television. This is, I believe, the IMDb of Anne of Green Gables. So this is the version I most remember from television. Here she is with the carpet bag, um, traveling, horse and carriage behind her. So it was an interesting take on it. She's always looking up. Why? What? What's up there? Yep, pulling her hair. No spoilers. No spoilers. But yes, that came out in 1985, and I remember seeing it on television. Okay. Close out of that. I don't believe we're gonna have any really cool pictures in this version. It is what it is. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade, but by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that is passed from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea, and out of it, who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet, with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in awed voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond, since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula just jutting out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, with water on two sides of it. Anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over the hill road, and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. That's a paragraph. Hmm. She was sitting there one afternoon in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in bridal flush of pink-white bloom hummed over by a myriad of bees. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man whom Avonlea people called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn, and Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing his on the big Red Brook field away over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew that he ought, because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. And yet, here was Matthew Cuthbert at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was a white collar and which was plain proof that he was going out of Avonlea, and he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel, deftly putting this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions. But Matthew so rarely went from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shyest man alive and hated to have to go among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel ponder Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Murillo where he's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of a turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled, that's what. And I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after Mrs. I am struggling today. Too many things going on in my brain. Okay. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She had not far to go. The big, rambling, embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal further. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from his fellow men without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the furthest edge of his cleared land, and there it was to this day, barely visible from the main road along which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not call living in such a place living at all. "It's just staying, that's what," she said as she stepped along the deep rutted, grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. I gotta say, classic literature as a whole, the way they describe things, which like this whole line of the deep rutted grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes, like that phrasing, it just it's so it seems out of place now. It's beautiful, it's wonderfully descriptive, but I feel like that sort of thought process is very different than modern authors. I digress. It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd. Living away back here by themselves, trees aren't much company, though dear knows if they were there'd be enough of them. I'd rather look at people. To be sure, they seemed contented enough, but then I suppose they're used to it. A body can get used to anything, even. Oh, wow. You remember how I was worried about something at the beginning? Okay. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said. What? What? Okay. With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was that yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows and on the other with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard over as often as she swept her house. One could have even eaten One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial peck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when bidden to do so. Yeah, that shoulder injury is really bothering me. I'm sorry. Okay, pop that. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unused parlor. Its windows looked east and west. Through the west one looking out on the backyard came a flood of mellow June sunlight, but the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding slender birches down in the hollow by the brook, was greened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert, when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken mental note of everything that was on that table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to eat, but the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was only crabapple preserves and one kind of cake. Uh, Is having more than one type of cake a common occurrence? Interesting. Um, hmm, so that the expected company could not be any particular company. Yet, what of Matthew's white collar and the sorrel mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with the unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. Oh, Bone, that's so kind of you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you. And Sino, I hope you enjoy the emotes. Good evening, Rachel, Marilla said briskly. This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks? Something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship existed, and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. Marilla was a tall, thin woman, with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot behind, with two wire hairpins stuck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was, but there was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. We're all pretty well, said Mrs. Rachel. I was kind of afraid you weren't though. When I saw Matthew starting off today, I thought maybe he was going to the doctor's. Marilla's lips twitched understandingly. She had expected Mrs. Rachel up. She had known that the sight of Matthew jaunting off so unaccountably would be too much for her neighbor's curiosity. Oh no, I'm quite well, although I had a bad headache yesterday, she said. Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight. If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually stricken dumb for 5 seconds. It was unsupposable that Marilla was making fun of her, but Mrs. Rachel was almost forced to suppose it. Are you in earnest, Marilla? She demanded when her voice returned to her. Yes, of course, said Marilla, as if getting boys from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia were part of the usual spring work on any well-regulated Avonlea farm, instead of being an unheard of innovation. Mrs. Rachel felt that she had received a severe mental jolt. She thought in exclamation points, a boy? Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, of all people, adopting a boy? From an orphan asylum? Well, the world was certainly turning upside down. She would be surprised at nothing after this. Nothing. What on earth put such a notion into your head? She demanded disapprovingly. This had been done without her advice being asked, and must perforce be disapproved. Well, we've been thinking about it for some time. All winter, in fact, returned Marilla. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was up here one day before Christmas, and she said she was going to get a little girl from the asylum over in Hopeton in the spring. Her cousin lives there, and Mrs. Spencer has visited her and knows all about it. So Matthew and I have talked it over off and on ever since. We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew is getting up in years, you know. He's 60, and he isn't so spry as he once was. I would like to point out that at 60, he's not as spry. But we being Americans are expected to work until we're 70 now. It's unreal. Okay. I I'm mad. I'm so mad that this is ugh. It's like he's getting on in years. He's 60. I'm like, well, it was hard living to be fair in the early 1900s, so maybe that's a contributing factor, but on God, like with modern medicine and access to nutrition, we're expected to work, another 10, 20 years past that. It makes me mad. Bear with me a second.
Drink water. Become moist.
Okay. Renewed and fortified, we shall try again. Also, yes, Fallon, I will stay hydrated. In fact, I've gone so far as to fill up my mini fridge with beverages, and so now I am going to switch from just plain water to coconut water by Vita Coco. So, different kind of electrolyte filled beverage. Matthew is getting up in years, He's 60. And he isn't so spry as he once was. His heart troubles him a good deal, and you know how desperate hard it's got to be to get hired help. There's never anybody to be had but those stupid half-grown little French boys. And as soon as you do get one broke into your ways and taught something, he's up and off to the lobster canneries or the States. At first, Matthew suggested getting a home boy. Oh, God, what is that? But I said no, flat to that. They may be all right, but I'm not saying they're not. But no London street. Oh, my Lord. I'm 8 pages in, and there has been 2 points of. I. This is what I was talking about in the scuff stream from earlier. The rampant the rampant racism during this era is just What am I supposed to do with that? But no London street Arabs for me, I said. Give me a native born at least. There'll be a risk, no matter who we get, but I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at nights if we get a born Canadian. So, in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us out one when we went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going, so we sent her word by Richard Spencer's folks at Carmody, to bring us a smart, likely boy of about 10 or 11. We decided that would be the best age, old enough to be of some use in doing chores right off, and young enough to be trained up proper. Okay. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. We had a telegram from Mrs. Alexander Spencer today. The mailman brought it from the station, saying they were coming on the 5:30 train tonight. So Matthew went to Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course, she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Mrs. Rachel prided herself on always speaking her mind. She proceeded to speak it now, having adjusted her mental attitude to this amazing piece of news. Well, Marilla, I'll just tell you plain that I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing, a risky thing. That's what. You don't know what you're getting. You're bringing a strange child into your house and home, and you don't know a single thing about him, nor what his disposition is like, nor what sort of parents he had, nor how he's likely to turn out. I don't. Mrs. Rachel, I just want to say that all children are products of their environment. No matter who their parents were or how they're going to turn out will entirely depend on the schooling and the care of the parents that raise him. What? What do you want about? Why, it was only last week I read in the newspaper how a man and his wife up west of the island took a boy out of the orphan asylum and he set fire to the house at night. Set it on purpose, Marilla, and nearly burnt them to a crisp in their beds. And I know another case where an adopted boy used to suck the eggs. They couldn't break him of it. If you had if you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I'd have said for mercy's sake not to think of such a thing. That's what. I feel like Mrs. Rachel is similar to like a Karen of her era, perhaps. Hmm. This job's comforting seemed neither to offend nor alarm Marilla. She knitted steadily on. I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel. I've had some qualms myself. But Matthew was terrible set on it. I could see that, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. And as for the risk, there's risks in pretty near everything a body does. In this world, there's risks in people's having children of their own if it comes to that. They don't always turn out well, and then Nova Scotia is right close to the island. It isn't as if we were getting him from England or the States. He can't be much different from ourselves. Well, I hope it will turn out all right, said Mrs. Rachel in a tone that plainly indicated her painful doubts. Only don't say I didn't warn you if he burns Green Gables down or puts strychnine in the well. I heard of a case over in New Brunswick where an orphan asylum child did that, and the whole family died in fearful agonies. Only it was a girl in that instance. Only it was a girl in that instance. Well, we're not getting a girl, said Marilla, as if poisoning wells were a purely feminine accomplishment and not to be dreaded in the case of a boy. Okay. I'd never dream of taking a girl to bring up. I wonder at Mrs. Alexander Spencer for doing it. But there. She wouldn't shrink from adopting a whole orphan asylum if she took it into her head. Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay until Matthew came home with his imported orphan, but reflecting that it would be a good 2 hours at least before his arrival, she concluded to go up the road to Robert Bell's and tell them the news. It would certainly make a sensation second to none, and Mrs. Rachel dearly loved to make a sensation. So she took herself away, somewhat, to Marilla's relief, for the latter felt her doubts and fears reviving under the influence of Mrs. Rachel's pessimism. Well, of all things that ever were or will be, ejaculated Mrs. Rachel when she was safely out of the lane, it does really seem as if I must be dreaming. Well, I'm sorry for that poor young one, and no mistake. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children, and they'll expect him to be wiser and steadier than his own grandfather. If so bees, if so bees he ever had a grandfather, which is doubtful. It seems uncanny to think of a child at Green Gables somehow. There's never been one there, for Matthew and Marilla were grown up when the new house was built. If they if they ever were if they ever were children. Okay. If they were if they were they blah, 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 blah. If they ever were children, which is hard to believe when one looks at them, I wouldn't be in that orphan's shoes for anything. My, but I pity him, that's what. So said Mrs. Rachel to the wild rose bushes out of the fullness of her heart. But if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been still deeper and more profound. Hey, Wild. Hi, Tiny. Just dropping a message to a friend to pick up a child like it's a shopping trip. Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Yeah. It clearly the adoption process was a very different thing during that era. I think it is clear that there's stuff going on behind the scenes. Ah, yes, Wild. It is a new book. This is Anne of Green Gables, which is a story set in Canada off of Prince Edward Island. Um, yeah, beautiful story. I talked a little bit about Lucy Maud Montgomery MacDonald. Her married Ewan MacDonald was her husband's name. Yes, it was on Netflix. My experience with Anne of Green Gables came from the 1985 TV series. So, I mean, it's been told and retold multiple times. There, there's already been two instances of like racist remarks. Um, I just questionable language. I I just want to preface to all of you dear listeners that are sticking around for this. Um, this book is clearly including some antiquated terms, terminology, turns of phrase that I do not use and I do not condone the use of in any sort of modern setting. Um, the in this case, the discussion of um, the houseboy, the discussion of hanging, like it just I mean, this is Anne of Green Gables. I am I'm floored like that so many books have so many like references that just blow my mind. Like I just you don't realize it because you these are books that were taught in school, when you're children, when you're young in elementary school, junior high, and high school, and that's 20 plus years ago, and it's like revisiting them now as an adult in this modern day and age and experiencing firsthand how inappropriate this language is. It's frustrating that it continues to exist in its original form. Um, do do we continue like that moralistic debate of, do we teach it as is and like use it as a teachable moment that this is not okay, or do we remove it and move forward in a golden, more rosier hue that like, oh, clearly, uh, I don't know. I am not. I'm not the person to make that decision. This is one of those times where like I'm like smart enough to recognize the problem, but I'm not smart enough to know the answer, the solution. Yeah, the significance. Honestly, I feel that media should be taught as is because it has both cultural and historical significance. I agree. I agree. It is it does have a lot of history and cultural significance. This is a famous Canadian author, but could we not like phrase things differently, I guess? Yeah, it is 100% a product of its time. I mean, this was reprinted in 1946, but it originally came out in 1908. So, written in 1905, submitted 2 years later to publishers in 1907, and finally published in 1908. But I don't know. It's just I'm reading to you, my captive audience, so to speak. I'm reading this word for word to you, and it's sometimes it's just shocking. All right. Well, because I scuffed the beginning of the stream with my um, original post, I am due for an ad break. I'm going to take a 3 minute, 3 to 5 minute break real quick. Be right back. I'm going to refill up my water bottle. I do have my coconut water and my coffee, um, but I'll just get everything dialed in and I will be right back for chapter 2. So hang tight. I will be right back. Okay, before that gets going again, which, by the way, fantastic, fantastic music from our end. I found that off of Upbeat, and if you're looking for music for your own streams, and they have everything from scary, spooky sounds to obviously full classical suites. All of it is open source and free to use for streaming. Yes, Valen, 100%. It's good tunes. I did just got did just receive further clarification that Prince Edward Island is the province, so it's like Prince Edward Island in its entirety is the province of Canada, and Cavendish is just a region within uh, Prince Edward Island. A magical transition tinkle. Um, yeah, I don't think I have one of those, but I will take it under advisement and look into it. Um, yes. All right, we are on to chapter 2. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. And grab that, pull and open that real quick. Quick hydration. Mm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. Matthew Cuthbert and the sorrel mare jogged comfortably over the 8 miles to Bright River. It was a pretty road, running along between snug farmsteads, with now and again a bit of balsamy fir wood to drive through, or a hollow where wild plums hung out of their filmy bloom. The air was sweet with the breath of many apple orchards, and the meadows sloped away in the distance to horizon mists of pearl and purple, while little birds sang as if it were the one day of summer in all the year. I'm guessing. I don't know how that is supposed to be sung. Matthew enjoyed the drive after his own fashion, except during the moments when he met women and had to nod to them. For in Prince Edward Island, you're supposed to nod to all and sundry you meet on the road, whether you know them or not. Matthew dreaded all women except Marilla and Mrs. Rachel. He had an uncomfortable feeling that the mysterious creatures were secretly laughing at him. He may have been quite right in thinking so, for he was an odd-looking personage, with an ungainly figure and long iron-gray hair that touched his stooping shoulders, and a full, soft brown beard, which he had worn ever since he was 20. In fact, he had looked at 20 very much as he looked at 60, lacking a little of the grayness. When he reached Bright River, there was no sign of any train. He thought he was too early, so he tied his horse in the yard of the small Bright River Hotel and went over to the station house. The long platform was almost deserted, the only living creature in sight being a girl who was sitting on a pile of shingles at the extreme end. Matthew, barely noting that it was a girl, sidled past her as quickly as possible without looking at her. Had he looked, he could hardly have failed to notice the tense rigidity and expectation of her attitude and expression. She was sitting there waiting for something or somebody, and, since sitting and waiting was the only thing to do just then, she sat and waited with all her might and main. Matthew encountered the station matter locking up the ticket office preparatory to going home for supper, and asked him if the 5:30 train would soon be along. The 5:30 train had been in and gone half an hour ago, answered that brisk official. But there was a passenger dropped off for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there on the shingles. I asked her to go into the ladies' waiting room, but she informed me gravely that she preferred to stay outside. There was more scope for imagination, she said. She's a case, I should say. I'm not expecting a girl, said Matthew blankly. It's a boy I've come for. He should be here. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was going to bring him over from Nova Scotia for me. The station master whistled. Guess there's some mistake, he said. Mrs. Spencer came off the train with that girl and gave her into my charge. Said you and your sister were adopting her from an orphan asylum and that you would be along for her presently. That's all I know about it, and I haven't got any more orphans concealed hereabouts. I don't understand, said Matthew helplessly, wishing that Marilla was at hand to cope with the situation. Well, you better question the girl, said the station master carelessly. I dare say she'll be able to explain. She's got a tongue of her own, that's certain. Maybe they were out of boys of the brand you wanted. He walked jauntily away, being hungry, and the unfortunate Matthew was left to do that which was harder for him than bearding a lion in its den. Walk up to a girl, a strange girl, an orphan girl, and demand of her why she wasn't a boy. Matthew groaned in spirit as he turned about and shuffled gently down the platform towards her. She had been watching him ever since he had passed her, and she had her eyes on him now. Matthew was not looking at her, and would not have seen what she was really like if he had been. But an ordinary observer would have seen this. A child of about 11, garbed in a very short, very tight, very ugly dress of yellowish gray wincey. She wore a faded brown sailor hat, and beneath the hat, extending down her back, were two braids of very thick, decidedly red hair. Her face was small, white, and thin, also much freckled. Her mouth was large, and so were her eyes, that looked green in some lights and moods and gray in others. So far, the ordinary observer, an extraordinary observer, might have seen the chin was very pointed and pronounced, that the big eyes were full of spirit and vivacity, that the mouth was sweet-lipped and expressive, that the forehead was broad and full. In short, our discerning extraordinary observer might have concluded that no commonplace soul inhabited the body of this stray woman-child, of whom shy Matthew Cuthbert was so ludicrously afraid. Matthew, however, was spared the ordeal of speaking first, for as soon as she concluded that he was coming to her, she stood up, grasping with one thin brown hand the handle of a shabby, old-fashioned carpet-bag. The other she held out to him. I suppose you are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables? She said in a peculiarly clear, sweet voice. I'm very glad to see you. I was beginning to be afraid you weren't coming for me, and I was imagining all the things that might have happened to prevent you. I had made up my mind that if you didn't come for me tonight, I'd go down the track to that big wild cherry tree at the bend and climb up into it to stay all night. I wouldn't be a bit afraid, and it would be lovely to sleep in a wild cherry tree, all white with bloom in the moonshine. Don't you think? You could imagine you were dwelling in marble halls, couldn't you? And I was quite sure you would come for me in the morning if you didn't tonight. Matthew had taken the scrawny little hand awkwardly in his. Then and there he decided what to do. He could not tell this child with the glowing eyes that there had been a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla do that. She couldn't be left at Bright River anyhow, no matter what mistake had been made, so all questions and explanations might as well be deferred until he was safely back at Green Gables. I'm sorry I was late, he said shyly. Come along, the horse is over in the yard. Give me your bag. Oh, I can carry it, the child responded cheerfully. It isn't heavy. I've got all my worldly goods in it, but it isn't heavy. And if it isn't carried in just a certain way, the handle pulls out, so I'd better keep it, because I know the exact knack of it. It's an extremely old carpet bag. Oh, I'm very glad you've come, even if it would have been nice to sleep in a wild cherry tree. We've got to drive a long piece, haven't we? Mrs. Spencer said it was 8 miles. I'm glad because I love driving. Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody. Not really. But the asylum was the worst. I've only been in it for 4 months, but that was enough. I don't suppose you ever were an orphan in an asylum, so you can't possibly understand what it is like. It's worse than anything you can imagine. Mrs. Spencer said it was wicked of me to talk like that, but I didn't mean to be wicked. It's so easy to be wicked without knowing it, isn't it? They were good, you know, the asylum people, but there is so little scope for the imagination in an asylum, only just in the other orphans. It was pretty interesting to imagine things about them, to imagine that perhaps the girl who sat next to you was really the daughter of a belted earl who had been stolen away from her parents in her infancy by a cruel nurse who died before she could confess. I used to lie awake at nights and imagine things like that. Because I didn't have time in the day. I guess that's why I'm so thin. I am dreadful thin, ain't I? There isn't a pick on my bones. I do love to imagine I'm nice and plump with dimples in my elbows. With this, Matthew's companion stopped talking, partly because she was out of breath and partly because they had reached the buggy. Not another word did she say until they had left the village and were driving down a steep little hill, the road part of which had been cut so deeply into the soft soil that the banks, fringed with blooming wild cherry trees and slim white birches, were several feet above their heads. The child put out her hand and broke off a branch of wild plum that brushed against the side of the buggy. Isn't that beautiful? What did that tree, leaning out from the bank, all white and lacy, make you think of? She asked. Well, now, I don't know, said Matthew. Why, a bride, of course. A bride all in white with a lovely misty veil. I've never seen one, but I can imagine what she would look like. I don't ever expect to be a bride myself. I'm so homely nobody will ever want to marry me, unless it might be a foreign missionary. I suppose a foreign missionary mightn't be very popular, very particular. But I do hope that some day I shall have a white dress. That is my highest ideal of earthly bliss. I just love pretty clothes. And I've never had a pretty dress in my life that I can remember. But of course, it's all the more to look forward to, isn't it? And then I can imagine that I'm dressed gorgeously. This morning, when I left the asylum, I felt so ashamed because I had to wear this horrid old wincey dress. All the orphans had to wear them, you know. A merchant in Hopeton last winter, donated 300 yards of wincey to the asylum. Some people said it was because he couldn't sell it, but I'd rather believe that it was out of the kindness of his heart. Wouldn't you? When we got on the train, I felt as if everybody must be looking at me and pitying me. But I just went to work and imagined that I had on the most beautiful pale blue silk dress. Pardon. Fallen back before consumer rights existed. Nowadays, you'd just print a postage paid return label and exchange her for a child of your choice. Oof. Oof. But I just went to work imagining that I had on the most beautiful pale blue silk dress. Because when you are imagining, you might as well imagine something worthwhile, and a big hat, all flowers and nodding plumes, and a gold watch and kid gloves and boots. I felt cheered up right away, and I enjoyed my trip to the island with all my might. I wasn't a bit sick coming over in the boat. Neither was Mrs. Spencer, although she generally is. She said she hadn't time to get sick, watching to see that I didn't fall overboard. She said she never saw the beat of me for prowling about. But if it kept her from being seasick, it's a mercy I did prowl, isn't it? And I wanted to see everything that was to be seen on that boat, because I didn't know whether I'd ever have another opportunity. Oh, there are a lot more cherry trees, all in bloom. This island is the bloomiest place. I just love it already. And I'm so glad I'm going to live here. I've always heard that Prince Edward Island was the prettiest place in the world, and I used to imagine I was living here. But I never really expected I would. It's delightful when your imaginations come true, isn't it? But those red roads are so funny. When we got into the train at Charlottetown and the red roads began to flash past, I asked Mrs. Spencer what made them red, and she said that she didn't know, and for pity's sake, not to ask her any more questions. One of those children. ADHD before it was ADHD. She said I must have asked her 1,000 already. I suppose I had too, but how are you going to find out about things if you don't ask questions? And what does make the roads red? Well, well now, I don't know, said Matthew. Well, that is one of the things to find out sometime. Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about? It just makes me feel glad to be alive. And it's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we knew all about everything, would it? There'd be no scope for imagination then, would there? But am I talking too much? People are always telling me I do. Would you rather I didn't talk? If you say so, I'll stop. I can stop when I make up my mind to it, although it's difficult. Matthew, much to his own surprise, was enjoying himself. Like most quiet folks, he liked talkative people when they were willing to do the talking themselves, and did not expect him to keep up his end of it. But he had never expected to enjoy the society of a little girl. Women were bad enough in all conscience, but little girls were worse. He detested the way they had of sidling past him timidly, with sidewise glances, as if they expected him to gobble them up at a mouthful if they ventured to say a word. This was Avonlea, type of well-bred little girl. This was the Avonlea type of well-bred little girl, but this freckled witch was very different. And although he found it rather difficult for his slower intelligence to keep up with her brisk mental processes, he thought he thought that he kind of liked her chatter. And so he said as shyly as usual, "Oh, you can talk as much as you like. I don't mind." "Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to get along together fine. It's such a relief to talk when one wants to and not be told that children should be seen and not heard. I've had that said to me 1,000,000 times if I have once. And people laugh at me because I use big words, but if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, haven't you?" Is she me? Is this me in another world, in another, like, a bygone era? Just like the whole time? I was a, like, excitable, chatty child. So this is wild reading about a girl that was, you know. so creative and imaginative, surreal. I'm having a surreal moment. Well, now, that seems reasonable, said Matthew. Mrs. Spencer said that my tongue must be hung in the middle, but it isn't. It's firmly fastened at one end. Mrs. Spencer said your place was named Green Gables. I asked her all about it, and she said there were trees all around it. I am gladder than ever. I just love trees, and there weren't any at all about the asylum, only a few poor, weeny teeny things out in front with little whitewashed cagey things about them. They just looked like orphans themselves, those trees did. I used to make me it used to make me want to cry to look at them. I used to say to them, "Oh, you poor little things. If you were out in a great big woods with other trees all around you, and little mosses and June bells growing over your roots, and a brook not far away, and birds singing in your branches, you could grow, couldn't you? But you can't where you are. I know just exactly how you feel, little trees. I felt sorry to leave them behind this morning. You do get so attached to things like that, don't you? Is there a brook anywhere near Green Gables? I forgot to ask Mrs. Spencer that. I forgot to ask Mrs. Spencer that. Well, now, yes. There's one right below the house. Fancy! It's always been one of my dreams to live near a brook. I never expected I would, though. Dreams don't often come true, do they? Wouldn't it be nice if they did? But just now, I feel pretty nearly perfectly happy. I can't feel exactly perfectly happy because, well, what color would you call this? She twitched one of her long, glossy braids over her thin shoulder and held it up before Matthew's eyes. Matthew was not used to deciding on the tints of ladies' tresses, but in this case there couldn't be much doubt. "It's red, ain't it?" he said. The girl let the braid drop back with a sigh that seemed to come from her very toes and to exhale forth all the sorrows of the ages. "Yes, it's red," she said resignedly. "Now you see why I can't be perfectly happy. Nobody who had red hair. Nobody could who had red hair." Shenanigans! Yes, we can be happy with red hair. Eh? I don't mind the other things so much. The freckles and the green eyes and my skinniness. I can imagine them away. I can imagine that I have a beautiful rose leaf complexion and lovely starry violet eyes, but I cannot imagine that red hair away. I do my best. I think to myself, now my hair is a glorious black, black as the raven's wing. But all the time, I know it is just plain red, and it breaks my heart. It will be my lifelong sorrow. I read of a girl once in a novel who had a lifelong sorrow, but it wasn't red hair. Her hair was pure gold rippling back from her alabaster brow. What is an alabaster brow? I never could find out. Can you tell me? Well, now, I'm afraid I can't, said Matthew, who was getting a little dizzy. He felt as he had once felt in his rash youth when another boy had enticed him on the merry-go-round at a picnic. Well, whatever it was, it must have been something nice because she was divinely beautiful. Have you ever imagined what it must feel like to be divinely beautiful? Well, now, no, I haven't, confessed Matthew, ingenuously. That looked weird when it's separated. Ingenuously. I have, often. Which would you rather be if you had the choice? Divinely beautiful or dazzlingly clever or angelically good? Well, now, I don't know exactly. Neither do I. I can never decide. But it doesn't make much real difference, for it isn't likely I'll ever be either. It's certainly it's certain I'll never be angelically good, Mrs. Spencer says. Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! That was not what Spencer had said. Neither had the child tumbled out of the buggy, nor had Matthew done anything astonishing. They had simply rounded a curve in the road and found themselves in the avenue. The avenue, so called by the Newbridge people, was of a stretch of road 400 or 500 yards long, completely arched over with huge, widespread apple trees planted years ago by an eccentric old farmer. Overhead was a long canopy of snowy, fragrant bloom. Below the boughs, the air was full of purple twilight, and far ahead, a glimpse of painted sunset sky shone like a great rose window at the end of a cathedral aisle. Its beauty seemed to strike the child dumb. She leaned back in the buggy, her thin hands clasped before her, her face lifted rapturously to the white splendor above. Even when they had passed out and were driving down the long slope to Newbridge, she never moved or spoke. Still, with a rapt face, she gazed afar into the sunset west with eyes that saw visions trooping splendidly across the glowing background. Through Newbridge, a bustling little village where dogs barked at them and small boys hooted and curious faces peered from the windows. They drove, still in silence. When 3 more miles had dropped away behind them, the child had not spoken. She could not keep silent, it was evident, as energetically as she could talk. I guess you're feeling pretty tired and hungry, Matthew ventured at last, accounting for her long visitation of dumbness, with the only reason he could think of. But we haven't very far to go now, only another mile. She came out of her reverie with a deep sigh and looked at him with the dreamy gaze of a soul that had been wandering afar, star-led. Oh, Mr. Cuthbert, she whispered, that place we came through, that white place. What was it? Well, now, you must mean the avenue, said Matthew after a few moments' profound reflection. It is a kind of pretty place. Pretty? Oh, pretty doesn't seem the right word to use, nor beautiful either. They don't go far enough. Oh, it was wonderful. Wonderful. It's the first thing I ever saw that couldn't be improved upon by imagination. It just satisfies me here. She put her one hand on her breast. It made a queer, funny ache, and yet it was a pleasant ache. Did you ever have an ache like that, Mr. Cuthbert? Well, now, I just can't recollect that I ever had. I have it lots of times whenever I see anything royally beautiful, but they shouldn't call that lovely place the Avenue. There is no meaning in a name like that. They should call it, let me see, the White Way of Delight. Isn't that a nice imaginative name? When I don't like the name of a place or a person, I always imagine a new one and always think of them so. There was a girl at the asylum whose name was Hepzibah Jenkins, but I always imagined her as a Rosalina de Vere. Other people may call that place the Avenue, but I shall always call it the White Way of Delight. Have we really only another mile to go before we get home? I'm glad, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry because this drive has been so pleasant, and I'm always sorry when pleasant things end. Something still pleasanter may come after, but you can never be sure, and it's so often the case that it isn't pleasanter. That has been my experience, anyhow. But I'm glad to think of getting home. You see, I've never had a real home since I can remember. It gives me that pleasant ache again, just to think of coming to a really, truly home. Oh, isn't that pretty? They had driven over the crest of a hill. Below them was a pond looking almost like a river, so long and winding was it. A bridge spanned it midway, and from there to its lower end, where an amber-hued belt of sandhills shut it in from the dark blue gulf beyond. The water was a glory of many shifting hues, the most spiritual shadings of crocus and rose and ethereal green with other elusive tintings for which no name has ever been found. Above the bridge, the pond ran up into fringing groves of fir and maple and lay all darkly translucent in their wavering shadows. Here and there, a wild plum leaned out from the bank into a white-clad girl tiptoeing to her own reflection. From the marsh at the head of the pond came the clear, mournfully sweet chorus of the frogs. There was a little gray house peering around a white apple orchard on a slope beyond, and although it was not yet quite dark, a light was shining from one of its windows. "That's Barry's pond," said Matthew. "Oh, I don't like that name either. I shall call it, let me see. The Lake of Shining Waters. Yes, that is the right name for it. I know because of the thrill. When I hit on a name that suits exactly, it gives me a thrill. Do things ever give you a thrill?" Matthew ruminated. "Well, now, yes. It always gives me a thrill to see them ugly white grubs that spade up in the cucumber beds. I hate the look of them." "Oh, I don't think that can be exactly the same kind of thrill." "Do you think it can? There doesn't seem to be much connection between grubs and lakes of shining waters, does it? Does there? But why do other people call it Barry's Pond?" "I reckon because Mr. Barry lives up there in that house. Orchard Slope's the name of his place. If it wasn't for that big bush behind it, you could see Green Gables from here. But we have to go over the bridge and round by the road, so it's near half a mile further." "Has Mr. Barry any little girls?" "Well, not so very little either, about my size. He's got one about 11. Her name is Diana." "Oh," with a long indrawing of breath, "what a perfectly lovely name." "Well, now, I dunno. There's something dreadful heathenish about it, seems to me. I'd rather Jane or Mary or some sensible name like that. But when Diana was born, there was a schoolmaster boarding there, and they gave him the naming of her, and he called her Diana. I wish there had been a schoolmaster like that around when I was born then. Oh, here we are at the bridge. I'm going to shut my eyes tight. I'm always afraid going over bridges. I can't imagine I can't help imagining that perhaps just as we get to the middle, they'll crumple up like a jackknife and nip us. So I shut my eyes. Side note, whenever I travel over bridges or through tunnels, sometimes I'll hold my breath. Do I need to? No. Is it superstitious? Absolutely. Is it somehow satisfying being able to hold your breath the whole duration of the bridge or the tunnel? Absolutely. But I always have to open them for all when I think we're getting near the middle, because you see, if the bridge did crumple up, I'd want to see it crumple. What a jolly rumble it makes. I always like the rumble part of it. Isn't it splendid? There are so many things to like in this world. There, we're over. Now I'll look back. Good night, dear lake of shining waters. I always say good night to things I love, just as I would to people. I think they like it. The water looks as if it was smiling at me. When they had driven up the further hill and around a corner, Matthew said, "We're pretty near home now. That's Green Gables over—" "Oh, don't tell me," she interrupted breathlessly, catching at his partially raised arm and shutting her eyes that she might not see his gesture. "Let me guess. I'm sure I'll guess right." She opened her eyes and looked about her. They were on the crest of a hill. The sun had set some time since, but the landscape was still clear in the mellow afterlight. To the west, a dark church spire rose up against a marigold sky. I gotta tell you, the way Lucy is writing the descriptive scenery is like eating like a saltwater taffy, or like a, what's the word, like a salted caramel candy. It just has this richness that is like savory at the same time. It's really beautiful. Sweet and savory balanced perfectly. She she opened her eyes and looked about her. They were on the crest of a hill. The sun had set some time since, but the landscape was still clear in the mellow afterlight. To the west, a dark church spire rose up against a marigold sky. Below was a little valley, and beyond a long, gently rising slope with a snug farmstead scattered along it. From one to another the child's eyes darted, eager and wistful. At last they lingered on one away to the left, far back from the road, dimly white with blossoming trees in the twilight of the surrounding woods. Over it, in the stainless southwest sky, a great crystal white star was shining like a lamp of guidance and promise. "That's it, isn't it?" she said, pointing. Matthew slapped the reins on the sorrel's back delightedly. "Well, now, you've guessed it. But I reckon Mrs. Spencer described it so you could, so's you could, okay. But I reckon Mrs. Spencer described it so's you could tell." "No, she didn't. Really, she didn't. All she said, all she said might just as well have been about most of those other places. I hadn't any real idea what it looked like. But just as soon as I saw it, I felt it was home. Oh, it seems as if I must be in a dream. Do you know, my arm must be black and blue from the elbow up, for I've pinched myself many times today. Every little while a horrible, sickening feeling would come over me, and I'd be so afraid it was all a dream. Then I'd pinch myself to see if it was real, until suddenly I remembered that even supposing it was only a dream, I'd better go on dreaming as long as I could. So I stopped pinching. But it is real, and we're nearly home." With a sigh of rapture, she relapsed into silence. Matthew stirred uneasily. He felt glad that it would be Marilla and not he who would have to tell this waif of the world that the home she longed for was not to be hers after all. "Come on, Matthew. No, she's wonderful. Keep her. She'll keep you entertained forever." They drove over Lynn's Hollow, and where it was already quite dark, but not so dark that Mrs. Rachel could not see them from her window vantage, and up the hill and into the long lane of Green Gables. By the time they arrived at the house, Matthew was shrinking from the approaching revelation with an energy he did not understand. It was not of Marilla or himself he was thinking of, the trouble this mistake was probably going to make for them, but of the child's disappointment. When he thought of that rapt light being quenched in her eyes, he had an uncomfortable feeling that he was going to assist at murdering something. Much the same feeling that came over him when he had to kill a lamb or a calf or any other innocent little creature. The yard was quite dark as they turned into it, and the poplar leaves were rustling silkily all around it. All round it. "Listen to the trees talking in their sleep," she whispered, as he lifted her to the ground. "What nice dreams they must have." Then, holding tightly to the carpet bag, which contained all her worldly goods, she followed him into the house. Ah, my goodness. 2 chapters in, 29 pages, and we're almost 2 hours into everything. Normally I would stick it out and try and do, I think, another chapter, but today has just been an overwhelming day. Good, bad, crazy, lots of news from work-related stuff, family-related stuff. So I think I am going to go ahead and skedaddle a little bit early today. I wouldn't normally, but I'm just quite feeling up to the read today. But it's okay. I'll make it up and try and do like 4 chapters on Friday. Let's find somebody as lovely as all of you are to go um, diving into, so to speak. Let's see. Who of our lovely friends is free? So Moon to Core is doing some art, lots of Fallout references. We've got oh, Magical Bard. Bard is I haven't seen Bard in ages. What do we got here? Bard is I know it's been a while since someone with style treated Twitch to a broadcast. Viewers rejoice. So Bard just moved somewhere in Europe. I want to say Germany. I'm not positive on that. So they just moved and settled in. I think this might be one of their first streams since they made the move. That would be really nice, I think, to have all of you get to see them. Um, Amazingly talented musician. They do a little bit of gaming. They do some reading. They do a little bit of everything. Um, I think it would be nice to go say hi. So let's go raid Dear Bard. A little early today. Like I said, we'll be back to normal programming on Friday without any further changes to my life and my schedule. So, Alioop, hold your horses and we'll go visit our friend. So, Magical Bard helps if I can spell. There you are. Okay, let's go visit Bard. And thank you all for listening today and catching the beginning of Anne of Green Gables. I appreciate all of my Librophiles that stuck around today. So let's go say hi. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and we'll go say hi to Bard. Alley-oop!